The work of JRR Tolkien often gets critiqued at times for the characters being too black and white. That they aren't written with a ton of complexity and they're actually fairly simple. But I am about 3/4 of the way done with my first read of Lord of the Rings. And side note, just make sure you subscribe because I'm giving all my thoughts as I read through this book. And I just finished the chapters where we meet Denethor. And as I'm reading, I wanted to write an essay about how Denethor and Theoden are essentially literary foils for each other. But then I just got to thinking how really there are so many literary foils in this book. It's almost like each character has a direct comparison, and that comparison really accentuates the qualities of their role. And Denethor and Theoden are this to a T. But so are Legolas and Gimli, and Merry and Pippin, and the Witch King and Aragorn, and Saruman and Gandalf. But also Sauron and Frodo, and Sam and Gollum. There are so many comparisons between these characters that really bring out the characters' qualities and show how these characters are actually a little bit more interesting than anything else. And as I was thinking about this, I realized that this perhaps is the reason why his characters might seem so black and white in the first place. Because if you spend time with this book, I do not know how you could, in reality, think that these characters are black and white. They're anything but that. They are so complex of characters. But perhaps on a quick reading, you might think of this because the idea of a literary foil is to essentially create another character so that your current one shines all the more brighter or is more dim. A literary foil is essentially just a character who is designed to contrast with another character. Usually the protagonist or another important figure, but in this book, it's like every single character has a foil. And they do this in order to just highlight particular qualities or strengths or flaws of that character. I think the word apparently comes from an old jeweler's practice of placing a shiny foil behind the gemstone to make it sparkle more. But I don't know if that's true because usually they put like a black felt thing down, so I don't know. But in literature, a foil essentially makes another character's traits stand out more, and they just compare these two characters. It's not necessarily an enemy or an opposite, but they share a lot of similarities, but the differences are kind of what makes the main character's traits a lot clearer to the reader. And again, I think this is the secret sauce for why Tolkien's characters are actually incredibly complex, and how these incredibly complex characters might be seen as a bit more black and white. Because Theoden is, by himself, a pretty interesting character in the book. He's got a lot of heart, but to be honest, he has a lot of flaws. He's not great at communicating or even ruling his people, to be honest. And that last phrase might be a bit controversial, but I think King Theoden is the kind of king who needs counselors. Denethor has them, but to be honest, might not need them. Well, I think he does need them because I sometimes think he's an idiot. But Theoden and Denethor are both super complex characters on their own. But when they're compared with each other, their good qualities show all the more. Well, the good qualities for the case of Theoden. And we all come to love Theoden despite the tougher other things that he does as a character. I think a great example of this is how he essentially entraps Merry and Éowyn back so they cannot fight. He loves them, and so he thinks he's actually trying to protect them by doing this. And perhaps he can do this with Éowyn, giving her the rule of Rohan in his absence, but he's really doing that to keep her out of battle. But he can't really do this with Merry. Well, he actually can because Merry pledged service to him, but still, Merry is of age and he can fight if he desires. Now, I think all of this could be chalked up to the fact that Tolkien really does write incredible characters. But also, I think he was very intentional with what he wanted to communicate with these characters in this specific story. So, by accentuating the flaws of Denethor, he then shines on the beauty of Theoden. But they're both still complex and flawed characters, deeply flawed characters. Both are pretty gray. Maybe not morally gray, but they're really complex in a gray sort of way. And they're not perfect characters. So I want to just talk about the idea of literary foils in this essay. And I want to keep going with Theoden and Denethor because they are just on the forefront of my mind for their comparison. Now, Theoden and Denethor are so clearly in the first 4 chapters of The Return of the King foils for each other. Currently, I am at the 4th chapter in my first time read, and they are just such a perfect comparison. Both of them are rulers of their respective realm. One is a steward and the other is the king. Both of them are in the middle of war. Both of them just lost their son and are in the middle of grief as well. Both of them as well are somewhat controlled by the enemy, Theoden via Grima Wormtongue and Denethor via the Palantir that I think he's looking into. We don't get confirmation of that yet, but that's kind of what I think so. Yet their response to all this is really what leads most readers to come to love Theoden and kind of think meh about Denethor. Well, maybe you don't really think meh of Denethor, but I can guarantee you that you probably prefer Theoden as a person to Denethor. Because in the midst of everything going on, Theoden is still marching to war. Their stories are so similar to each other, but Theoden is marching off to war. One of the first things he does when he comes out of his stupor that Grima puts him is he gets ready to march to Helm's Deep to fight. He doesn't linger in pity or grief for too long, if not at all. Now, this can be all chalked up again to grief and how different people experience grief, but Denethor, on the other hand, is consumed by his grief, and he feels like his people are failing, and rather than get all of his forces ready to fight, essentially he feels like giving up, and he locks himself in a room with Faramir, who is close to death, and he mourns over his nearly dead son's body, giving up. Commanding his guard, too, to bring wood so that he can burn his son alive. That's kind of what I'm assuming is actually going to happen. I don't know for sure if that's going to happen because I'm not at the part in the book where that becomes a reality. But for Denethor, you have this overly wise king, or an overly shrewd king, perhaps is the better way to say it, who is smart but isn't very kind. And in Theoden, you have a king who seems to lead with his heart and relies a lot on counsel to give him advice for what to do. So much so that when he's actually marching to Helm's Deep, he wishes for Grima Wormtongue to be there to give him counsel, which is wild, to be honest. But there's another moment in the 4th chapter where Denethor says this to Pippin. "For one has come that I feared." "Not the Dark Lord," cried Pippin, forgetting his place in his terror. Denethor laughed bitterly. "Nay, not yet, Master Peregrine. He will not come save only to triumph over me when all is won. He uses others as his weapons. So do all great lords if they are wise, Master Halfling." However that may be, the Captain of Despair does not press forward yet. He rules rather according to the wisdom that you have just spoken, from the rear, driving his slaves in madness on before. Denethor is almost attempting to take an example out of Sauron in the Witch King's book by saying that they are driving men forward from the back of battle, and so that's what I, Denethor, am doing too. But it's interesting, because for Theoden, he actually did that in the Battle of Helm's Deep. He was stuck in the tower, kind of driving his forces from the back, not really even fighting. But I do not see him doing this going forward. He is the first one to ride out of the camp to muster the men of Rohan, and I feel like he is the first one that's going to charge into battle because he is leading with his heart now. He's becoming a good king because he's doing that. So these two characters, I think, stand united on the same side, but also really, really opposed to each other. In a really astute comment on the last video from Michael, the two hobbits who are at the sides of each respective king are foils not only to each other, but they're also foils to the one they serve. There's like a completion going on. It's a brilliant comment. Denethor is a brilliant mind, and who is the one that accompanies him? It's Pippin, who is a lot more heart than he is mind. And Theoden, who has a lot more heart, is actually accompanied by Merry, who's probably the smartest of the 4 hobbits in the book so far, because he studied maps and he studied the entire journey in Rivendell. So they get these characters that are almost there to help complete them, and I'm assuming help complete their arcs. But let's talk about Merry and Pippin, because they also kind of complement each other, and they're foils for each other, showing how bravery isn't just a one-size-fits-all solution, but how their courage in their pledging for Gondor and Rohan are both done in very different ways. One is almost done as like a recompense, and the other one is done out of a desire to fight for his friends. Both are kind of done in the same way, but they're different at the same time. But they are both noble and strong because of it. And it shows how bravery can even come from the most unexpected places, like small hobbits. On top of this, I think you actually have the Witch King and Aragorn, who are foils for each other. In the passing of the Grey Company, Aragorn takes up the army of the dead, and the end of the book says that he is the one that's leading the army of the dead from the front. And in the final moment of siege, the Siege of Gondor chapter, which I just finished, which is the greatest ending to a chapter that I've ever encountered in my life, the Witch King, in a shocking move, is the first person to enter into the city of Minas Tirith after Gron destroys the city gate. Both are leading their forces from the front, showing that courage is done in different ways. But they are obviously very different in characters too, because one was the previous king of men and one is the not yet king of men. And they are almost vying for power and control, but the ultimate power in the realm is Sauron. And this one is really interesting because he is hiding. It's interesting that he really wants the ring to be invisible, but at the same point, he has not shown his face yet in the books. He's already invisible. And in the same way, I think his literary foil is actually not Sauron, or is actually not Gandalf or another powerful person. I think it's Frodo. A person who is perhaps the least likely creature to be given the ring to destroy it. Yet Frodo has immense strength because of his bearing of the burden of the ring. Not in the power that the ring is giving him, but in his strength of will and perseverance in spite of the ring. And his courage to march into the face of certain death in order to save the Shire. But Sauron is the ultimate power in the realm. For sure the strongest character and the strongest being in Middle-earth at the moment. But he's hiding behind Mordor, not wanting to come out, almost out of fear. And so for these two characters, you're almost getting a true depiction of what courage and bravery actually looks like. Then I look at two characters like Gimli and Legolas. Two people who are very, very different from each other. And they have very, very different backgrounds and very, very different upbringings. But these two are kind of like the Romeo and Juliet of the story, in a totally non-romantic way. They are such strong friends and have such a bond of unity to them that they are breaking down the walls between elves and between dwarves. Two races that absolutely hate each other. And here is an axe wielder and a bow carrier. One seems dainty and the other kind of seems gritty. But they work together and they complement each other perfectly in this story. Then I look at another character like Samwise. And for all of his flaws in the book, and he has a lot of flaws in the book, he has a lot of perfection in the book, because I was trying to think about who his literary foil is, and then I realized it's right in front of him. It's Gollum. And the reason why Samwise is the way that he is, and his character is coming out so much, is because he's being pushed by Gollum in this way. They are such polar opposites of each other. In one, you have a character who is very temperamental, and he's all over the place, who is in and out and doesn't really know what he wants or what he thinks. And in the other, you have someone who is steadfast, who is convicted and firm and resolute, and knows from the very first step that he takes out of his house that he is going to stay by Frodo's side until the day that he dies. And so both of their characters are coming out, their good sides and their bad sides. But the bad side is accentuated a bit more because Sam is the literary foil for Gollum, and Sam's good side is accentuated a little bit more because Gollum is the foil for Sam. I think of another character like Gandalf and Saruman too. Both are from the same order, probably a similar background, but look how each one of them came out. One came out with pride, the other kind of stayed humble. Saruman wanted power, so he messed himself up, making a ring and a cloak of many colors, but Gandalf resisted the power and the draw on the ring, and the draw of the ring on him, and humbly served at Frodo's side, always having the temptation of the ring at his side, but overcoming it, and showing the value of humility, even if you are extremely powerful. I think Boromir and Faramir are actually the brothers who are foils for each other. One succumbs to the temptation of the ring, and the other resists. One is braver than the other, and the other is wiser. And in the books, Faramir looks all the better because of the flaws of his brother Boromir. But at the same time, Boromir is really shown to be a great character as well because of sometimes how great his brother is, but Faramir does have flaws as a character, and I think those flaws are even shown in Denethor. And there's like a little trifecta going on with their relationship. It's like three foils for each other. And so one thing that I think Tolkien is so good at is just creating comparisons between characters that really accentuate the good and the bad qualities of that character. But sometimes it makes these characters seem black and white rather than the gray, complex characters that they are. So because I see a character like Faramir in comparison to his brother Boromir, I'm in love with Faramir as a character. Just personally, I love him. I think he's the greatest character ever. But at the same point, he has deep flaws as a character. And if you do a careful reading of the character of Faramir, I think you're going to be able to see some of those flaws. And I think the movie maybe took some of those flaws and made them a lot bigger than what they really are, because I think he has other flaws than just a desire to be loved by his father who isn't really loving him. But I really think Tolkien is doing such an excellent job of just showing you the small little comparisons between each character and between how this character is really good because this character is really bad, or vice versa. And so when you actually look at these characters individually, I think they become so complex as characters. And it really shows how brilliant Tolkien is at creating characters that are gray, characters that are really, really complex, but sometimes seem black and white even though they're not, because they are directly compared with another character. It is yet again the example of Tolkien's sheer brilliance all throughout his work. And I am just astounded at how good he is at writing characters. Some people have complained that his characters are really flat, but I have found anything but that as I've been reading this for the first time. It is actually astounding to me that anybody can read this book and say that his characters are flat, or that they prefer other people's characters in conjunction with his. Because his characters are just so real and so flawed and so gritty and so good and kind. They have all these elements that I have within myself, but it's like one of my favorite parts of this story is that I can see myself in every character. And I have the potential to be like a Faramir. But unfortunately, sometimes I'm more like a Boromir. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because Boromir is brave in some ways, but has pride. And so within this story, I see myself in every character, and I have desires to be more like these specific characters in every single way. But I also find myself attracted, or not attracted, but I find myself in reality kind of like some of the darker side of these characters as well. I find myself grumpy like Samwise and like Gandalf. Sometimes I find myself temperamental like Gollum, which is a scary thing to be. But also, I want to be brave. I want to be wise. I want to have the courage of Frodo and the wisdom of a Faramir. And even someone as like Icky, I still think he's Icky as Denethor. I would love to have the wisdom of Denethor. He's almost too wise for his own good, and he's almost too shrewd, but he still has a lot to offer, and he's still an interesting character, maybe the most interesting character in the book. And so I just think that Tolkien's work is just so good in how he creates these great characters, but then makes them black and white because he's creating literary foils for other characters in the pages of his work. And it's yet another tally on the brilliance of JRR Tolkien and how he is just the most premier writer that I've maybe ever encountered in my life. But that's all I got for today. Make sure you subscribe if you liked the video. Also, like the video if you made it this far. And as always, remember to look toward Numenor that was, and beyond to Elven home that is, and to that which is beyond Elven home and will ever be. I'll see you in the next one.